Okay, time for a new video, and whether you are somebody new to my channel or you are returning to my channel to watch this video, it is greatly appreciated. As always, I'm filming this video in one go, so if I stumble over my words moving forwards, apologies about that, and also apologies if the quality of this video is fairly poor as well. If there's any lag, anything like that at all, sadly it can't be helped, and hopefully it's not too much of an issue for you. This is yet another Eurovision related video here on my channel, although it is something rather different to anything I filmed in the past, although I have had plans to talk about this on my channel for some time now. I've no idea if anybody's going to be interested in it, but today I'm going to be talking about a time in my life when I was really focusing on the contest in a literary sense, because several years ago I studied a Master of Fine Arts degree here in England at home via Manchester Metropolitan University, and for the manuscript part of that course I chose to focus on Eurovision. And I have the document in front of me, the actual final manuscript, which was printed off twice and sent up to Manchester Metropolitan right before the pandemic became a thing. And I was thinking that today I would talk about that whole process a little bit. And if any of you are remotely interested in hearing the poems that made up that manuscript, then I may well read them out in future videos. Certainly they are all available online to read. There'll be a link in the description to my Hello Poetry page where you can read those poems, although you will have to scroll quite far back in time to see them if you so wish. And there are links in the description as always to my other social media pages as well. Check them out if you want to. So this is probably going to be definitely a rambling video from me. I've no idea how long it's going to be. But long story short, I have always been, since I was very young at the very least, interested in writing creatively. I enjoyed it when I was much younger, when Harry Potter was a big deal. And over time, I just started taking it more and more seriously. I went to the University of Northampton, which is my local university here in England, and I studied creative writing for 3 years there, full time. That was in person, and I graduated with a first. And a couple of years passed, and it was always a possibility that I was going to study further. And after some deliberation, I chose to do so, but I knew it wasn't going to be feasible for me to study away from home, so I ended up doing a distance learning course, and it was 3 years because it was part-time, and it was via Manchester Metropolitan. And I studied creative writing, but this time it was specifically in poetry, which is the form of writing that I had started to enjoy more and more when I was an undergraduate student. And with this Master of Fine Arts degree, the whole third year pretty much was devoted to working on the manuscript, the big dissertation, whatever you want to call it. And I had no ideas for it. I really didn't have a clue what to write about. And I thought about other things that I was interested in, and Eurovision was obviously there at the forefront of my mind. And so, after some discussions backwards and forwards online with my supervisor and what have you, I ended up going down that route, and for many, many months on and off, I wrote poems with Eurovision right there at the forefront of my mind. The manuscript itself is called Welcome Europe. I'm looking at it right now. It says here that it's 1,053 lines long, and for the record, I don't know what it's like abroad, I don't know what it's like at other institutions, but the whole marking system with poetry is, it's the amount of lines you write, not the amount of words. So it's more of a line count that equates to a word count. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. This is all really, really boring stuff that I'm sure none of you are interested in. But I had to write, I think it was somewhere in the region of 30 poems. They could be in any form I liked. I had a great deal of support from lecturers and the like at Manchester Met, and I spent a good deal of time putting them into an order that I liked. The manuscript is called Welcome Europe because they were the first words of the first contest of this millennium. You'll perhaps remember, certainly you might well have seen it online somewhere, the Stockholm 2000 contest one of the greatest openings, one of the simplest openings to a Eurovision we've ever had. We had that sort of introductory film, and then you had the young woman on stage, and she said, "Welcome Europe," and then all of the lights came up in the Globen. And I just thought that was absolutely terrific, and I thought about that pretty early on in the process of writing this manuscript, and that's why the manuscript is called Welcome Europe. The poems are not specifically about Eurovision itself, but there are elements of Eurovision within each piece. I was thinking more about the culture of different locations. I was thinking about the language in different countries. I was thinking about music. I was thinking about literary references and things like that. And I'll go through the feedback that I actually received when I received my final grade for my Master of Fine Arts degree shortly. But I'm looking at the poems here, and I thought that I would just talk about them a little bit. I'm already rambling big time, and as I said a moment ago, I'm not sure many people are going to be interested in this, but if you do want me to read some of these poems aloud in future videos, I may well do so. The first poem is called Riesenrad Vienna. Something else I should say is that the titles of these poems were originally going to be coordinates for a city that has hosted the contest in the past. That changed, and the poem titles ended up being either a location or a landmark in a previous host city, the title of a former Eurovision song, and that's about it, I think. Yes, it's either a location or it's the title of a Eurovision song, and I would take that song title and interpret it in my own way and create a poem as such. So Riesenrad Vienna, obviously Vienna has hosted on 2 occasions in the past. The Riesenrad is a bit like Vienna's version of the London Eye. It's a big Ferris wheel. And this was the first poem that I wrote for the manuscript, and I think it sets the tone for the whole manuscript because it mentions the German language, it mentions the Hofburg Palace, of course, it mentions coffee houses, it mentions how Vienna hosted the year that Sandy Shaw won, and it mentions how Vienna is the heart of Europe, essentially. So I think that is a nice introduction to what's to come. However, I've never really liked that poem. The second piece is called Un peu de poivre, un peu de sel, a bit of pepper, a bit of salt, and this is named after Belgium's entry in 1966 by Tonya. And this poem is fairly similar to one that I wrote years before this. It is about a parent baking with their child, so using a little bit of pepper and a little bit of salt. That's what the poem's about, and I'm quite happy with that one. Then we have Litmus Madrid. Well, that's an example of a poem that's not named after a landmark or a Eurovision song, but obviously Madrid was a host city back in the late 1960s. And that poem is about, I guess, a sort of love affair in Madrid and the heat of it all. And that's what that poem's about, essentially. Arthur's Seat, Edinburgh. Arthur's Seat is a very notable location in the Scottish capital. You can walk up it, great views of the city. And that's sort of about a love affair as well, to be honest with you. Not exactly wildly different subject material there. That's probably why those 2 poems are together, actually. Then we have Shalom Tel Aviv. And Tel Aviv was the host city in 2019, around the time that I was working on this manuscript quite intensely. This poem is about watching people. It's about people watching. Specifically here, watching people playing beach volleyball whilst drinking a coffee. It's inspired by the writing of William Carlos Williams, whose work I was getting into at the time. Then we have Rock and Roll Kids, which is the title of the Irish winner in 1994 by Paul Harrington and Charlie McGettigan, my favourite Irish entry thus far. This poem is partially inspired by a really fantastic movie called Sing Street, and it's about a teenage band getting ready to play the prom, and it's written in quite a relaxed style, I would say. Of course, Rock and Roll Kids, the song, is super stripped back. It's a ballad, but this is more actual rock and roll, I suppose. Quite happy with how that one turned out. Then we have Gamla Stan Stockholm, and this is actually one of the poems that I submitted early on, because there was a process during the whole third year where you had to put a couple of the pieces that you had been working on into a document and send that to your supervisor, and they would give you a bit of feedback and essentially tell you whether you're on the right track or not. And I put this one in that document, and I did have some nice feedback about it. Gamla Stan is the old town in Stockholm. Obviously, Stockholm has hosted a few times in the past. This is very similar to the Vienna one that I mentioned a minute or two ago. It mentions Pippi Longstocking, it mentions a political party, it mentions Waterloo, it mentions Melfest, so that's a specific Eurovision reference. It mentions Lisbeth Salander from the Dragon Tattoo series. It mentions Avicii, who I think passed away not long before I wrote this poem. I could be wrong. But anyway, that's that piece. Very backwards and forwards in terms of its layout. Then we have La Voix, The Voice, which is the Swedish entry in 2009 by Malena Ernman. And I'm not the hugest fan of that song. But of course, as I'm sure we're all familiar with now, Malena Ernman is the mother of Greta Thunberg, the climate activist. This poem is from Greta Thunberg's point of view. And it was a bit risky, but the idea for it came into my head quite quickly. And yeah, it didn't take long to write that one. It's very simple in terms of its language. Then we have Virgin's Apartment, Athens. Of course, Athens hosted in 2006. This is about people visiting the Acropolis. And I had to do quite a bit of research because there are lots of names for different parts of that complex. And apparently it means Virgin's Apartment, or one area of the Acropolis means Virgin's Apartment. I wrote this years ago. My memory is not what it used to be. But it mentions the theatre of Dionysus, Phidias, Aeschylus, Thespis, all of these names of old. And I suppose with some of these poems I gravitated straight towards a really notable landmark, whereas perhaps I should have focused on other things instead. I don't know. Anyway, the next poem, bear with me, is Vishlat Nyar, Summer Gone, which was the Hungarian entry in 2018 by AWS. And this poem, in my opinion, is one of the most satisfying I wrote for this document. It is about a student moving away from home for university. And I'm really happy with how that turned out, to be honest with you. Might read that one aloud in a future video if people are interested. Then we have a really long piece, which is called Le Dernier qui a parlé, The Last One Who Spoke, which was the French entry in 1991 by Amina. And this is about, again, it sort of ties in with the previous piece, but it's set further forwards in time. This is about somebody who goes to a party at university and being struck by somebody's beauty, I guess. I stayed awake with the shape of your face as though viewed through cellophane. You mattered somehow, electrocution right into my brain, your secrets swallowed by the ghosts of the night. Hell, I thought, resting with my vivid fabrications until the next day, the next year. That's the last verse, if you were wondering. Quite a long piece. Then we have Seagulls Brighton. Brighton hosted in 1974 when ABBA won, and the nickname of Brighton and Hove Albion football team is the Seagulls. This poem is from the viewpoint of an elderly man reflecting on his university days, and he's got cancer. So he's in a sort of reminiscent mood, I guess. I'm really happy with how that turned out, absolutely. It was going to be more football-based. It mentions ABBA, because ABBA won in Brighton. It is what it is. Then we have Markthal Rotterdam. And if I remember correctly, the Market Hall, or Markthal, is that big sort of cylindrical building, and you can go inside it, and it looks as though it's made of glass, and there's loads of shops and stalls inside. I can't quite remember. But I wrote this not long after Rotterdam was confirmed as the host city for 2020, and then of course the pandemic came along. So maybe this whole manuscript would have looked very different had it been written a year later. It mentions Amstel, it mentions the language, it mentions Edam cheese, and a whole bunch of other bits and pieces as well. Again, backwards and forwards in terms of its layout. Then we have Schottenhamel Munich, and Schottenhamel is one of the tents at Oktoberfest every year. And this is about that particular event, which takes place in Munich. So it mentions a particular brand of beer, or lager, whatever it is. And it's essentially about drinking and watching other people drink. It's a bit of a long piece, but it's not the longest poem in this document. Then we have Ghost by Jamie Lee for Germany in 2016. This poem could not be further away from the actual song where I got the song title from. And of course, we've had so many songs in the history of Eurovision. Some of them have interesting titles, some of them do not. Ghost is not exactly the most riveting song title we've ever had, but I suppose it struck a chord with me. This poem is about the assassination of Olof Palme, who was the Prime Minister of Sweden way back in the day. Nobody knows for sure who did it, although there is a main suspect. And I was reading about this at the time, and this is about the person who shot him, the Prime Minister. It's from the viewpoint of that person. Take my truth any way you want, they'll be chasing me forever. If they come, I shall admit, I know murder like the back of my hand. Yes, maybe a bit challenging to write that poem. I had to do a reasonable amount of research for it. But there we go. I think the most important thing for me, certainly after I'd written maybe half of these poems, and taking into consideration the feedback that I had from my supervisor, was every piece has to stand alone. Every piece has to feel a little bit different, be a little bit more experimental with the form. So I was really trying to do that. Then we have Ponte Sant'Angelo in Rome. This is a notable bridge in the capital city of Italy. Nothing that amazing there. That is about somebody receiving a postcard from Rome. And the bridge is the picture on the front of it. Then we have, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation here, Rue Sigefroid, Luxembourg City. Luxembourg City was definitely a place I wanted to write about, and I should say I have another document here with all of the host cities we'd had up to that point. And I knew I wanted to write about some, and other ones I knew that I was going to have to maybe do a little bit of research and find something to write about. So in the end, I knew I didn't want to write about London. I nearly didn't write about Istanbul, nearly didn't write about Moscow, I think, didn't write about Riga, although I started many pieces and never finished them, and then obviously I had to put the whole document together. This one made the cut. This is about passing through Luxembourg City for work, but stopping off to see a friend at the same time. Yes. Not much else to it. Again, fairly long, over 2 pages, pretty much. Then we have Tumpeia Castle, Tallinn. And I believe this is where the Estonian government meet up. Don't quote me on that. It's quite a notable structure, and a very old building in Tallinn. This is about just looking at that particular building. And I can't really remember exactly what else. I'm looking at it right now. I think it's about Estonia's Independence Day, maybe? There's this whole story about a Danish flag fluttering in the wind, falling from the sky. I mention it right here. I can't quite remember. My Estonian history is clearly not what it used to be. You'll have to forgive me. But anyway, that's what that poem is. And it mentions cornflowers, which I believe is the national flower of Estonia. Then we have Rødgrød, Copenhagen. This poem is about two people having a meal. And again, I am butchering the pronunciation here, but Rødgrød med fløde, which I think is like red oats with cream. It's one of the most difficult phrases for non-Danish people to pronounce, apparently, as you just witnessed. And this poem, every single O in the poem has the strike through it, like you would see in the Danish language. The language fluvial, like a lake sluicing weeds. Consonants like dripping water, vowels that huddle together as if the cold is coming in. The irregular, phlegmy intonation. So that's specifically a poem about the language, linguistics, I guess. Then we have Occhi di ragazza, which was Gianni Morandi's entry for Italy in Amsterdam 1970. This is only 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines long, and it is about somebody's eyes, because Occhi di ragazza means girl's eyes. Super, super simple. Then we have Lake Lugano, Lugano. Lugano hosted in 1956, and obviously Lake Lugano is right there. And this is more of a prose poem, and it's about a one-night stand. Yes, it also mentions Frankfurt and Cannes, which were the next two cities in Europe to host Eurovision after 1956. That was a bit difficult to write. Then we have Arcade, which was the winner for Duncan Lawrence, the Netherlands, in Tel Aviv. This is about playing snooker in an arcade. It's that simple. And being a big snooker fan, I enjoyed writing that one. Could be a bit stronger, but let's not be self-critical here. Then we have Lushniki Moscow. So this is the longest poem in the manuscript. And it is about England playing at the World Cup in 2018, which was staged in Russia. And the final was played at the Lushniki Stadium in Moscow. Again, backwards and forwards. It mentions Luka Modric. It mentions lots of other bits and pieces here. Several locations in England. Bolton, for example, gets a mention. Yes, indeed. Quite a long piece. Quite a long piece. Then we have Beyoğlu, Istanbul. This is a particular neighbourhood of Istanbul, which hosted Eurovision in 2004. And it's essentially about how Istanbul straddles two continents and how it's a big, sprawling place. Again, references to the language, whirling dervishes, Galatasaray, etc. We're getting through it, we're getting through it. We then have Messieurs les Noyés de la Seine, the Drowned Men of the Seine, which was Belgium's entry, one of their entries in 1956, by Fudd Leclerc. And this is a poem about bodies being hauled out of the Seine, which apparently does happen somewhat frequently. They hauled them from the river after 3 weeks, discarded dummies, skin puckered like crushed lavender. It's a poem in 2 halves. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And I did do a bit of research for that poem. I remember looking at newspaper reports of such a thing. Fairly morbid, but there we are. Then we have Van Gogh Museum Amsterdam, and this came to me very easily. I knew that if I was going to write about Amsterdam, it was going to be about Van Gogh, because I really do enjoy his work. And this is about 2 people who've gone on holiday to Amsterdam and they are in the Van Gogh Museum looking at one of his paintings. And it also mentions stroopwafels, Anne Frank, and Heineken. Fairly stereotypical, perhaps. Saudade Lisbon was the second poem I wrote for this manuscript. Saudade is a word, quite a powerful word, I suppose, which is used to emphasize a sense of longing, I guess. I'm not doing that word any justice, but that's, I suppose, a very loose translation of the word. A sense of really missing something, a sense of longing for something. It's also quite a peaceful sounding word, I guess. Anyway, that's the Lisbon poem, which also mentions Amar pelos Dois, which was the Portuguese winner at Eurovision in 2017. Then we have Krasi Thalassa ke Tagorimu, Wine, the Sea and My Boyfriend. This was Greece's debut entry in 1974 by Marinella. It is from the viewpoint of a woman on a date. 2 years, but will we make it to 3? And it mentions souvlaki, Greek salads, and cucumbers. I'm just scanning over it on my screen right now. Really quite happy with how that one turned out. She Lies Oslo is about a little structure in the water. I don't know whether it's still there, I assume it is, but if you go to Oslo and you go to the Opera House, just off to one side in the water is this shard-like floating structure, and it's called She Lies. And this poem is partially about that, but also about wondering if somebody is a liar. Fairly happy with that one. Museum of Broken Relationships, Zagreb. This is a real place. People go and donate items from relationships that have not worked out. So I think there's like teddy bears and buttons and items of clothing in this very unusual museum. And I know it's a bit of a tourist destination in Zagreb. So it is about somebody going, and I'm just trying to work it out here. Yes, I think it's about somebody going to donate an item to this museum. Then we have one of the less interesting pieces. It's called Fire Baku, and it's about somebody who's working in Azerbaijan on a business trip, and they can see the flame towers and everything. They're calling home, blah blah blah. Can't be many more poems here. Hunter of Stars, which was Switzerland's entry in Copenhagen 2014. That's a really simple piece. It is about watching children playing in a park. I've just realised that sounds quite dodgy. But that's what it's about, watching a dog playing in the park as well. La la la. Then we have Dingo Bar Paris. So the Dingo Bar was a location in Paris back in the 1920s, I believe, and it's where loads of writerly people would gather. People like F. Scott Fitzgerald, Hemingway, they're mentioned in this poem. It's from the viewpoint of F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote The Great Gatsby, etc. There's dialogue in this piece, and so on. Took a while to really get that poem right. And then we have Liffey, Dublin. Could have written about Mill Street, of course. That would have been more of a challenge. But I ended up plumping for Dublin, which has hosted more times than anywhere else in Europe. And the Liffey is the river that runs through the city. Really quite happy with that. There you go. It mentions UCD. It mentions crack. It mentions gobshites. And you say your father remembers 62, which is a line from Rock and Roll Kids, so that relates to a poem earlier on. And it also mentions Guinness, because of course, this is Ireland. Anyway, what a massive ramble. I don't think many people will have been interested in what I just said. But I thought that I would sit down and talk about it a little bit, because it was a time in my life happening when I was making videos as well, where I was really focusing on the contest and European culture in a way that I'd never really considered it before. In terms of the feedback that I got, I have the email here, which came on April the 21st, 2020. Blah, 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 blah. I'm not going to go through it all, but I received a score of 68%, which I was actually somewhat disappointed with. But then, when I looked at the grade boundaries, I realised that I was actually very close to getting a distinction, even though it's only 68%. Anyway, I'm quite happy with it now, but at the time I was somewhat disappointed. I suppose I aim high and I'm very self-critical with my writing, but there we are. Lots of feedback. That's it. If you want to hear some of those poems, let me know. I will be back at some point very soon with a Junior Eurovision related video. I've been putting it off, I guess, for reasons I don't really understand myself. I've just been busy with other bits and pieces. Maybe my interest in Junior Eurovision is not that high this year, I really don't know. The contest is nearly upon us. But I will be making a video about Junior Eurovision fairly soon. And I will also be doing another What We Know So Far video fairly soon. We are getting the Montenegro contenders very soon. We are getting the Spanish lineup very soon. We have all but one of the names for Estonia now. I think we're probably going to be getting news from Malta at some point. There's stuff left, right and centre from San Marino, which I'm not really keeping up to date with at all because it's such a mess. And I think Norway might be saying something fairly soon as well, but don't quote me on that. Anyway, that's it. Hopefully the quality wasn't too bad. Let me know your thoughts on this very different video. I wouldn't be surprised if it doesn't fare well at all. Until next time, take care of yourselves, stay safe, and bye for now.